Did the resurrection actually happen? Hello, today I want us to remember William of Ockham, who died on this day in 1349. He was a theologian, philosopher, and probably remembered best, perhaps only, for Occam's razor. Occam's razor is the theory that if you have a problem, the solution is likely to be the one that requires the least number of assumptions to be made. And since this is Easter week, I thought it might be interesting to apply this particular method to the stories of the resurrection. Because if, for example, we look at the idea of an empty tomb, if you're going to assume that the body was stolen, which I think is the only alternative to a resurrection, then you're making some quite big assumptions, not least not really knowing who had a motive for doing so. So I think the empty tomb, which is attested to by all four gospel writers, looks likely, according to this way of looking at it. And then the next question is, if the tomb was empty, what happened? And the interesting thing is that if you look at the four Gospels, they all have very different accounts of what happened, how it was discovered. And this is strange because there are almost all the other stories about Jesus in the Gospels are repeated in at least one other Gospel. So why, in the case of the resurrection, are none of the stories repeated? They all have in common the fact that the tomb was empty, but they all have different ways of describing who discovered it and what happened to them immediately afterwards. I think here we have to say that these stories are based on historical fact that different members of Jesus' group of friends did arrive at the tomb and discover what had happened, that it was empty. But that around those visits to the tomb, other ideas, other stories have emerged, so that I wouldn't myself want to vouch for the absolute historical accuracy of every single account of the visit to the empty tomb. But what they're trying to do is to explain in story terms, and how else can you explain something so extraordinary? To explain in story terms the impact that this had on those first disciples. So if we are going to the rule as to which solution has the least assumptions, I think the answer is we assume that these stories are very different, because they are different people's way of describing an experience they had. I think that's the solution to that problem, that requires the least number of assumptions. But probably the most effective and for me most persuasive argument that the resurrection happened is the change that took place in the lives of the disciples, and the enormous power and energy with which they then proceeded to go and take the good news of the resurrection all over the known world. Because you can assume, if you like, that this was some kind of mass hypnotic effect. That they all, or you can assume that they were all caught up in some great conspiracy. But the suggestion that requires the least assumptions, Occam's razor, is that they were inspired by a conviction that Jesus was alive. And this is what sent them out to explain it all and to tell everybody about it. And so today I, for myself, using the Occam's razor method, want to reaffirm my conviction that Jesus did rise from the dead, and my conviction too that we have no real evidence as to how that happened or what its immediate effects on the disciples were. Frank Morrison wrote a book some years ago called Who Moved the Stone? He set about trying to disprove the resurrection. He wanted to write a book which showed that Jesus couldn't possibly have risen from the dead. And in the end, having looked at all the evidence, he came to the conclusion that there was no other way of explaining what happened other than to say, yes, Jesus did rise from the dead. There was an empty tomb, and it was the power of the impact of his resurrection that sent the disciples all over the world to tell people about it.